In this video I'll demonstrate how to utilize data binding within our applications. And I'll actually create two applications in one. The first one will be just give us the ability to scroll back and forth and view one record at a time within our data set. And then the other form will allow us to see a data grid where we can view all of the records in our data set. So the first thing we need to do is create a new WinForms application. Select Visual Basic and make sure we've selected Windows Application. Let's go ahead and lop this off here. And we'll call this Lesson 19. And this will give us the start that we need. And so what I'm going to do here will take just a few seconds. We're going to set up the design of this application by putting a couple of labels, a couple of text boxes, and a couple of command buttons. And we'll arrange these in just a second here. Let me make our form smaller. I'm going to call this first button BTN Open. It'll actually open the database for us. The next one will allow us to go backwards, so we're going to call this BTN Previous and set the text to Previous. And this button will be the next button. It'll go forward in our result set. So let me go ahead and organize these buttons a little bit. Now I'll set the text here. This will be the company name, the contact name, and the contact title. And we'll move these over a little bit. And they'll have corresponding text boxes with each field. This first one, let's go ahead and clear out the text on each one. This first one will be a name that we can remember. TXT company name. This will be TXT contact name, and finally TXT contact title. Okay. Let's save our work up to this point. So now it's time to use a new object. We're going to go to the Toolbox's Data tab and drag and drop the OLE DB data adapter onto our designer, and that pops open the data adapter configuration wizard. We're going to select which data connection that should be used. In this case, the first one that pops up for me is the one I want, the front page database. It will create some SQL statements for me. That looks great. I don't really have another choice. Then it asks what data should be loaded in. Here I'm going to use the query builder. Select the customers table, click Add, close, and then click OK. So select all star from customers. Let's move on. And it says that it has successfully created a bunch of stuff, and we'll talk about what that stuff is in a little bit. Let's go ahead and hit Finished. Notice that now it creates a connection for us with all the stuff filled in that we need, all the connection string information, and we have a data adapter. The next thing we're going to do is generate a data set that's based on the information selected within the data adapter. So I'm going to click this little link, Generate Data Set, when I have the data adapter object selected, and when I do, it pops open the Generate Data Set dialog box. I'm going to leave all the settings the way that they are. So we'll create a new data set called dataset1, and it'll contain one data table, which will come as a result of the customers table in our database, and we'll add an instance of that data set to this designer. So let's see what this did. First of all, I created a new file called dataset1, and then created an instance of that file here within our Form 1 designer. If I take a look at the data set and double click it, you'll notice something eerily strange about this, and that is it is an exact duplication of what we have in our database. If you recall from the lesson text in lesson 19, it says that a data set is kind of a surrogate for the data that's retrieved from the database. So it needs the exact same structure as the database table that it originally pulls from. And so that's why it looks identical to what we saw in the database, in the Access database for Northwind. I'm going to go and close this and get back to my main designer view. Let's take just a minute to look at the data adapter. If you recall from the lesson text, assuming that you've already read it, the data adapter has a very important purpose, and that is to collect information from an original data source and give it to a data set, and then once changes are made to that data set, it resolves those changes back into the original data source. Since it has that functionality, it will essentially own 4 different command objects that you don't see here on the designer surface but do exist even though they're not visible. You have a select command object with its own command text property, command type, the connection object, and everything. They're all rolled up into this select command property. And then you have properties for other commands. This is a delete command, so it's an ole db command just like any other one that we've used up to this point, but it knows how to do something different. Instead of selecting, it knows how to delete from the database. Here's an insert command, another command object, and its command text is a SQL statement that knows how to insert new records into the data set, or rather back from the data set into the original data source. And then finally the update command, another command object that has SQL text in it that knows how to update data back into the original data source. So we didn't have to write any of these SQL statements. We didn't have to create any of these extra data commands. They're just here automatically by virtue of the fact that we used the data adapter and then clicked on the configure data adapter link. Or as we dragged and dropped on our surface, that configure data adapter wizard automatically came up. So the data adapter is a key to using the data set. You can't really have a data set without a data adapter in terms of its usage within a database. The data set is a container for the data that we'll retrieve from the database. So let's take the steps to do that right now. In the Open button, let's double click it and get to the source code view and shut down some of these windows that we don't need anymore. The very first thing that I'm going to do is create an instance of the Binding Manager base. If you recall from the lesson text, the Binding Manager base has a unique role, and that is to signal to all the controls on the Windows form that a position change has occurred, whether we've gone back in the records in the data set or forward within the records of the data set. It needs to tell all of the controls that are participating in data binding that a change has occurred, and so you need to update your data. And its use will become a little bit more obvious in just a moment. The next thing I'm going to do is paste some code that I've already created into my button open click event. Here we have our data adapter, and you recall from the lesson text we use the purpose for the fill method, and that is to grab information from the database using the select command that was set up for us and stick all that information into our data set. This is our instance of our data set, specifically the customer's data table within our data set. That's what this line of code does. The next line of code gets a reference to this form's binding manager base. And we do that by using me, which is a reference to the form itself. The form has a binding context object that is of type binding manager base. Don't worry about that for a moment. We're going to pass in a reference to our data set and tell it what table that we're going to bind our Windows form to. And then finally we're going to tell the binding manager base what record to start on. We can set this at any number, but it's safe to start at the very beginning, position 0. Now before we test our application, let's go ahead and create code for our previous and our next buttons. This becomes really easy. We'll set the position property to whatever it currently is, -1. And we'll set the next event, we'll set its binding manager base position property to whatever it is, +1. So we'll move backward and forward, within our data set by doing this. Let's go ahead and test our application now. Well, no, we got one more thing we need to do. It just doesn't happen automatically. We have to tell each of the text boxes that we want them to participate in the data binding and tell them what to connect to. So here we're going to go to the properties. Let's pin this down now. And we'll go to the data section, click on the data bindings, and for text we'll drop it down and select our data set, the customers table, and then we want it to reference the company name field, so we'll select that. In a similar manner, we'll do this for the contact name, and for the contact title. So these three text boxes are now data bound to the values in our data set. So let's go ahead and run our application, and if we did everything right, it should work. Click the open, and notice that we get the first record from the database, and I'm going to click the next button, next, 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 and previous, 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 till we get back to the first record. Pretty cool. We didn't have to write a whole lot of code, and it gets easier with the more fields that are involved, because all we have to do is just set the data binding reference in the properties window. And so for 3-4 lines of code here, we were able to enable quite a bit of functionality. Let's create another form within our application. We'll accept the default name of Form 2. That's not a problem. And what I want to do as well, while we have the Solution Explorer here, I'm going to change a property which starts Form 2 as the startup as opposed to Form 1. So that means when we hit the Run button, Form 2 will start up instead of Form 1. Now I'm going to show you how to enable some really cool functionality that's provided for us by the data grid. The first couple of steps are going to look exactly the same as we create a data adapter. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to the Data tab of the toolbox and drag and drop over the OLADB data adapter. It's going to pop open the data adapter configuration wizard. Let's go ahead and click Next. Ask for the connection. That's the one we want. Use SQL statements. Sounds great. We'll use the query builder. We'll select the customers table, select Add, and then close it up. We'll tell it we want all the records from the customers table for now. And it creates everything for us. Excellent. The next thing we need to do is select this Generate Dataset. Now, since we're going to use the exact same data set, we can select Existing. However, notice here that we've already got a customers table in our data set, so we shouldn't have to do this. I'm going to click cancel because I do not want to generate the data set. The data set's already been generated for us. Remember, the data set is just like the database. It creates a structure within which we will place the records that we get from the database. What I'm going to do instead is pull one over from the toolbox. I'm going to drag and drop the data set here, and it'll give us this add data set dialog. We can select typed or untyped. Basically, typed means do you already have one in place that you want to use? And the answer to that question is yes. If not, we can just use one that doesn't have a type specified. But let's go ahead and use a typed data set. Less than 19 data set 1. That's the one that's currently in our project. I'm going to click the OK button. Okay, so we have a reference now to data set 1 called data set 11 here on our designer surface. Now I'm just going to add two things to our form. The first thing is going to be a button. Where's our, there we go. Put that there, and then the next thing we're going to put on here is the data grid. And I'm going to widen this up a little bit, stretch it out. There we go. We'll put this down here. We'll call this button open. And we'll call our grid DG for data grid. And just something generic like form 2. Could call it customers. That's probably a better name for it. Let's go ahead and call that. Doesn't really matter. We're not going to really refer to it in code anyway at this point. The next thing I need to do is associate this data grid with the customers table of data set 1. And to do that, I'm going to select my data grid, go to the properties window, and select the data source as data set 11, and the data member, I'll select the customers table. Notice when I do that, that it gives us kind of the headers for the column names of the customers table. That's a good sign. However, we're not done yet. We need to write some code. How much code do you think we need to write in order to get all the records out of the database and plop to here into the data grid? Well, the answer is just one line of code. That's what is so neat about this. Let's double click the open button, and I'm just going to paste in a line of code. Olay data adapter 1, we call that fill method again. We pass in the name of the data set, our reference to it within our local form, and then the data table we want to use, the customer's data table. And I think that's all we'll need to do. So let's go ahead and run our application. Click the open button, and here we go. Notice how much functionality was enabled just by doing that. But wait, it gets better. What we can do is actually make changes. Notice that there's a little pencil with an ellipsis, which means that we're currently in edit mode for this row. So if I want to get rid of the DF on the end of Mexico, and I can change any other information about this, a change is made to the underlying data set. Will this change get propagated back into the database? Well, yes and no. No, not the way that it works right now, because we'll have to write one or two more lines of code. Yes, from the perspective of pretty much the hard work's already done. So we have a complete user interface just by dragging and dropping a data grid onto our design surface and then writing one line of code. Let's see, can we delete a line of code? Here we've selected 120 Hanover, and yes, we can delete a line from our data set. And can we add a new one? Yes, we can. I can type new values in. Okay. But again, none of these changes will actually happen even though they're stored in the data set right now, they're not stored, they're not going to get propagated back to the original data source. So we'll need to write a little bit more code to make that happen. Let's go back to our application here, and I'm going to drag and drop and put a button here. And this button will be called Save. So you can amaze your friends and your family with how easy this is. So I'm going to paste in one line of code. And notice here that I'm calling simply one method, the update method, and I pass in the data set into our data adapter. By doing that one simple thing, notice what I can do now. I'll go ahead and click open. First thing I'm going to do is delete a record that I added to test this functionality out. So I've selected it over here in the left-hand column, then I click the delete key on my keyboard and it's gone. Here I'm going to change this from Seattle to Redmond. And then I'm going to also add a new row that I'm just going to put all A's in here just to test out. Okay, so now I'm going to click the Save button, and everything looks great. The true test will be to close the application down and to reload the whole thing from the database to see if the data changes actually propagated back correctly to the database. So let's click Open, go to the very bottom. First of all, notice that it doesn't say Seattle, it says Redmond. That's cool. Our deletion of our record, I forget what it's called, but I think it had some like QWERTY in it. It's gone, but a new row exists with all A's in it. So we've enabled inserting, updating, and deleting of data in addition to viewing all the data from a particular table of our database with just a few lines of code. That is the power of data binding. And that's why it's good to have data binding in your arsenal, because sometimes you want to create some very simple applications that just enable some very simple functionality, and as we'll discuss in the next video or two, it's not for everybody all the time, but it does have its place and its purpose, and it does it very well. So I encourage you to go through the exercise in Lesson 19 on your own to get a little bit of practice in doing this with your own hands, thinking through each step on your own. And then you'll definitely want to spend some time with Lesson 20, where we talk about another alternate way, a more, how should I say it, it's more complex, but it's more accepted in the development community to do what we just did here with updating records and inserting and deleting records, but in a more code-intensive type of way. And there's some reasons why we'll do that. We'll discuss that in Lesson 20. Thank you.